Welcome to Sales for Nerds. I'm your host and chief nerd, Ruben Swartz. If you started a business because you love serving clients but realized you didn't like the sales and marketing aspect of running that business so much, this is the podcast for you. Sales and marketing doesn't have to suck. It can actually be a lot of fun. And on this show, we're going to teach you how to connect instead of network, teach instead of market, help instead of sell, so you can keep serving people even while you're building your pipeline and growing your business. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have with me John Tyreman of Red Cedar Marketing. He is an expert at helping other expert businesses grow their businesses via podcasts. He's also the host of two podcasts, Podcasting and Professional Services and Breaking Biz Dev. And John and I actually recorded some stuff for his podcast this morning over coffee. We're back here this afternoon. John, welcome to Sales for Nerds. What do you have in your glass?
Cheers, Ruben. I have a hazy double IPA from a Virginia brewery called Stone Brewing out of Richmond, Virginia. And this one is called FML. No, that doesn't stand for Fuck My Life. It stands for Fear Movie and Lions.
Okay, if you say so. No, that sounds great. I've got another glass of Patroni Sangiovese, which is actually a California Sangiovese from Sonoma County. Great to have you here, John. I'm guessing that you did not grow up aspiring to help businesses with their podcasts. Tell me a little bit about how you got here.
Wait, first I want to get the crack of the can in the mic.
There we go.
There we go. All right. How did I get here? Actually, you know what? Funny enough, I grew up playing music and in my parents' basement and recording music. So that's kind of how I got into audio, audio recording and engineering. And then I was in being in bands all through high school and everything. I learned that I really needed to promote the shows that we were playing and promote like the EPs back then. You were able to burn music onto cassettes into CDs and then kind of grinding, handing them out and everything. And so that's kind of how I got into marketing a little bit. So I guess, all paths led me to this moment where I combined those passions and marketing and audio production.
Well, what did you play?
I am a drummer
Oh,
and
awesome.
well, I play a bunch of instruments, guitar, bass, and I played in various bands. But I'm a drummer at heart. That's what I started out with. It fits me, I think, because most of my career, I'm more of an analytical marketer, and drumming is very analytical to me. It's very black and white. There's notes and it's very rhythmic and pattern oriented. So yeah, drums is still my thing. I play in a band every now and then. I'm in part time on the side, so that's always fun to kind of keep that intact.
Well, good for you. And I've never played in a band and don't have the talent to do that, but I am looking across the room at my guitar, which is actively gathering dust. Um, and at some point should get taken out and played a little bit here and there. So that's such a great backstory. I love that. And once you got into business and marketing, how did you decide, hey, podcast or things that I should focus on? I mean, even if you've got an audio bent, there's a bunch of things you could be doing.
That's true. Yes, very good question. So in 2019, I launched the first podcast. Actually, let me back up a second. So in 2019, I was working at an agency in Washington, D.C., and I had about a 90-minute commute to the office and a 90-minute commute back.
Ah,
And I was working there. In 2015, I moved out into the country, and so I was working kind of hybrid, part-time remote, part-time in the office, a couple of days a week in the office. And that commute was just kind of a slog. And so I burned through all of my sports podcasts. And then I was like, okay, what the heck am I going to listen to now? And so I put on some other shows like B2B Growth and a couple of other business podcasts, Two Bobs, Rattle and Pedal, to name a few. And that inspired me to go to some of the leadership within the agency and say, we should launch a podcast. And in 2019, we did just that. So I co-hosted the Visible Expert podcast with Kelly Waffle in 2019 and 2020, and that went really well. And from there, I actually left that agency and went into a director of marketing position at another digital agency in DC. And part of the strategy was to launch a podcast. So I hosted another show called Digital Marketing Troop. and that I interviewed technical experts in like marketing analytics, paid media, SEO, some really technical stuff. And then from there, I was laid off in September or October of 22, and I lucked into a client and started my own kind of solo consulting business. And then after a few months, I realized I really needed to narrow my niche down um, to and specialize. And so I focused on podcast marketing for professional services firms, and that's where I am today.
So how did you realize, there's a lot of things I want to highlight here, but I
Sure.
think the thing that's most remarkable, because I'm always banging the drum. If gosh, look at me, I'm making drum references now. Um, of specializing and defining a niche
Hmm.
and getting narrower, and especially when you feel most nervous about it, that's when you most need to do it. And most of us, myself included, get to that point and we go, "Oh no, like I can't possibly do that right now. I need to go broader." How did you actually understand, "Hey, I need to focus"?
So the agency that I worked at for 7 years, Hinge Marketing, is an agency that's focused on professional services firms. I led up the research team there when I in my time there, and we every year we studied the fastest growing professional services firms and what they did differently. And the common theme every single year that we did that study was specialization, the focus on specialization and focus on digital marketing. And so, just from my experience doing that research, but then doing research for firms and understanding that kind of broader context and then applying it to those professional services firms in a branding context, I knew that I needed to take that step. I felt too generalist. My
Mhm.
positioning when I first started was, a fractional marketing for B2B and professional services. And to me, that was a little too broad. I needed to refine the service offering. What service do I want to offer that? And then B2B was B2B software too. I had some clients in that space, and I knew I just needed to refine it a little bit more. And so I did.
That's awesome. One of the things that I always tell people is if you have an "and" in your target market profile, you have a problem,
Yep.
right? That's a red flag. So you noticed that and you did, and it probably helped that you had done all that research in the background. That's amazing. So when you started focusing on this, what were you doing to actually get clients?
Yeah. So I you got to practice what you preach. If you offer marketing services, part of your marketing strategy needs to include the value that you offer to clients. And so, knowing this, what I did is I launched two podcasts in Q4 of 23, podcasting and professional services. That show is an interview based show. Ruben, you were a guest on that earlier today.
Right?
That show is an interview based show where I interview successful business podcasters, and it acts as research for me so I can like understand like, okay, these folks that have been doing this for years, like, but why, how are they still in the game, right? If they've published over 100 episodes, then they must be doing something right. It must be having some kind of a business impact. What can I learn from them? But then these folks are also a couple steps ahead of me. So then their insights, if I'm able to share that with my audience who they're considering launching a podcast, that's valuable information and examples for them. So that was the role of that. That's the role of that show in my marketing strategy. The other show that I have is called Breaking Biz Dev, and I co-host that show with Mark Wainwright. What we do is we beat up and break down topics related to business development. I bring kind of the marketing perspective. Mark brings the sales perspective, and he and I have a lot of fun on that show. It's more of a co-hosted kind of buddy show where we kind of like beat up the topics, just he and I. But we've experimented with a couple of different episodes where we bring in some different voices, talking about what's broken in business development and things like that. And we've had a lot of fun with that. But that podcast also fuels my marketing strategy because I'm practicing what I preach, right? Here's an example of a show. It's also focused on professional services firms. So it's adding value in a different way to my broader target audience.
And just to be clear, when John and I spoke about getting on each other's podcasts, and he said he wanted to interview podcasters who were a couple steps ahead of him, I disqualified myself. So if you're sitting here thinking, why would I listen to John? He's claiming he knows even less than you. That is not actually the case. He's just being modest. And we had a great conversation. But I think the other thing that I want to highlight there is, in addition to whatever direct biz dev opportunities your podcast is creating for you, it's a great way to do market research. You get to like ask
Yes.
people whatever the heck you want and just keep
Yes.
asking and asking and asking and learning all kinds of amazing stuff that happens to coincide with hopefully what you're trying to do business wise.
That's totally. I love that you brought that up and that you highlighted that because it really is a great source of market research. And it's a great source of market research if you're looking to do, research on your ideal customers. It's a great source of research if you're looking to gather interviews to develop a book later on down the line. So there's a number of different ways that you can use a podcast for research. And I just it's I like to think that, I don't know everything. And so that's why I like to interview a lot of different folks, a lot of different podcasters, because there's always something that I take away as the host. There's always an insight that I take away that I try to apply. And I know my audience will pick up on those insights as well.
I think that's such an important point as well, because there's a lot of pressure when you're an expert in something, right? Because you're selling your professional services. I must be good at this thing and I must know everything. And of course, no one can know everything. And being able to show up and say, I am here to learn
Exactly.
is such a refreshing, fun thing to do, aside from whatever business development benefits you get down the road. I think that's really powerful, right? Getting to be not necessarily a beginner, but getting to be the learner because you're asking people who have a specific expertise, helping them unpack that for your audience, also providing value to yourself. I think that's tremendous. Now, uh, we had a guest on here a few years back, Michael Greenberg, who talked about using podcasts strategically, where you kind of interview your ideal prospects and use that as a direct sales channel. And I think you can apply that, but there's a lot more value that you can get from B2B podcasting. And I guess if you're for people listening to this, if you don't have a podcast and you're thinking of starting one, what should you be thinking about that would tell you whether that's even a good idea or not?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into the decision to launch a podcast. And in fact, I wrote a blog post about that just the other day, and it was titled "Should You Launch a Podcast?" So folks that are listening to this, go check that out. It's on my website. Um, and there's really five things that you really need to consider. Number one, how does your podcast roll up to your business goals, right? And so that could mean a lot of different things. Of course, many small businesses are going to say, well, I want it to generate revenue, right? That's the number one goal. But how do you plan to generate revenue? Are you going to generate leads for services? Are you trying to increase your authority in the marketplace so that you can command higher fees? Are you trying to improve your close rates? Are you trying to build out a course and community? Are you trying to attract sponsors? So these are a lot of different ways to grow revenue. But if those are some of the things that you're thinking about, a podcast is a great way to contribute to revenue in that way. So that's kind of like the first thing that I would think of is how does it roll up to revenue? The second thing I would ask is, why would your ideal clients listen,
Mm.
right? And if you can answer that question, like I think that there's who is it? Edison Research. They do a study every year. I think it's Edison Research. Um, and they found no, it was Pew Research. Pew Research did this study, and they found that the top two reasons people listen to podcasts are to be entertained and to be educated, right? To learn something new. And so, if you can achieve one of those two things with your podcast, if you can help your ideal clients learn something, or if you can entertain them enough to hold their attention, and there's this term in the industry called edutainment. I don't know if you've
Mhm.
heard that or not,
I
but it's kind of
have and I hate it, but I get what you're saying.
I hate that. It just sounds weird to say.
Hmm.
But when you're combining, you're making learning fun, right? I think Scotty Scarano from Accounting High does this really well, where he includes hip hop music about accounting topics
A
into his
natural pairing.
podcast. Right, exactly. But it's cool and it's catchy and it's fun to listen to. So why would your clients listen? And then of course you got to go out and you should do market research. How many podcasts are there in your niche, right? And I think a lot of people think, everyone has a podcast these days, but that's not entirely true, right? So there's 3.6 million podcasts out there, right? Compare that to 600 million blogs. So it
Mhm.
pales in comparison to the number of blogs in the first place. But of that 3.6 million podcasts, only 8% are business shows. And then 15% of those business shows are active. So chances are, with the right strategy, with good content, and with a consistent publishing cadence, in just a year's time, you'll be the top podcast in your niche.
If you define your niche.
If you're able to define your niche, yes, going back to your point about specialization.
And
Yep.
I think you asked a great question earlier. Why would your ideal client want to listen to this?
Mhm.
And I'm gonna go out on a limb, and you could feel free to disagree with me and say that
Sure.
your ideal client is, unless you're extremely charismatic, your ideal client is probably not going to listen solely because they can get entertained by you. They are going to want to be educated, and entertainment is a bonus.
I think, to some degree that's true. And if you don't have a very charismatic personality, then you should have a curious personality. And that what I mean by that is if you have a more curious mindset and if you're operating in that growth and learning zone that we alluded to earlier, and you bring on guests that maybe they do have a more charismatic personality and you're able to extract insights from them, you're able to extract that kind of persona out of your guests that adds value. It could add an entertainment value to your guests or to your listeners. So I think if you don't have a charismatic personality, have a curious personality.
When I think that's essential if you're interviewing people anyway, right? You've got to
Sure.
be curious.
Oh,
And some
totally.
people, not everyone has to have an interview show. So that's another question. So
Yeah.
let's assume that you go through this process. People read the blog post and they say, "Yes, I would like to start a podcast for my business." What type of podcast should somebody start, and what types of podcasts are there that people might even consider?
Yeah. So I am lucky enough to have hosted two interview shows and two podcasts with a co-host. And I can tell you from my firsthand experience that having a co-host is just this multiplier effect for your podcast. You're able to cross pollinate your network with your co-host's network. You're able to have different episode types. For example, you could interview each other. You could interview your co-host, or you could have this kind of like ping pong back and forth that happens between co-hosts. You could tag team an interview. You could go out and separately interview people and then have those episodes on your podcast. So you're kind of splitting work.
Hmm.
Because there's two hosts, there's twice as much promotion power behind the show, too. So I would highly recommend if you launch a podcast with a co-host. And if you don't know where to look, I would look at your referral partners. Um, people that offer maybe their tangential services to your target audience. Maybe if you're a professional service provider, you start a podcast with a technology platform or a software as a service provider who serves your target audience. So there's different ways to look at it, but find someone who adds strategic value to your target audience, and chances are you're going to have overlap in the kinds of topics that you want to talk about.
So that's a great point. And obviously I'm screwing that up, but have a co-host who serves your same audience, but from a slightly different perspective.
Totally. Yeah, you nailed it.
Okay, awesome. So let's assume that you do that. How do you, like, most people are probably going to have multiple candidates for that co-host, hopefully.
Potentially.
How do you choose, or can you have more than one co-host? How does this work?
Yeah, I think there's no rules in podcasting. That's the beautiful
Mm,
part of it. Is there's it's an art, and even when it's applied to business. And so, if you want to have multiple co-hosts, if you want to have five people that are like, "Hey, I'll do a podcast with you when I've got time," maybe I'm really busy And so you can have this consortium of hosts that show up when they're available. That's certainly one way to do it. I wouldn't rule that out.
In fact,
So
that's how one of my favorite podcasts works. Behind the Bastards, they just sort of have this rotating crew
there you
of
go.
they're not even co-hosts. They're sort of between co-hosts and guests. They're just there to provide color commentary.
There you go. Exactly. And I think it also you should think about how your personality jives with the potential co-hosts that you're thinking about launching a podcast with. You got to have good chemistry. I think that's an important piece.
That's a great point. And sometimes you can use medicinal tools to increase chemistry if you need to.
Cheers.
So okay, great. Let's say you've got a co-host or several co-hosts, or you have that all sorted out. What kind of logistics do you need to figure out? If you've got co-hosts, do you still need guests? How often do you publish? How long should episodes be? Where do you publish? Do you use tools? Like, there's a whole bunch of logistical things that people need to figure out to actually get published. How many episodes do you need to have in your backlog before you launch? Blah, 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 blah. What's the podcasting 101 here?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's I think the bare minimum that you need to launch a podcast is an audio file, artwork, and a name. Right?
Okay.
That's the bare minimum. And to get there, you can take a number of different paths. Um, I think a good place to start is to ideate different topics with your co-host, or if it's a monologue, or ideate the different kinds of guests that you would want on your show. So let's just pause for a second and let's say that we're talking about an interview show first.
Mhm.
The way that I would recommend approaching the guests that you bring on when you're first launching a podcast is organize your contacts into three buckets. So first you have friendly contacts who are willing to help you out. So these are folks who they know you, they trust you, and you tell them that you're launching a podcast, they'd be willing to hop on the mic with you,
Mhm.
right? There's
Maybe recommend
another.
some other people who would be good guests.
Sure, yeah, exactly. But the point is that they're willing to get on and record with you.
Okay.
And then from there, launch with that. I would recommend launching with a batch of episodes, two or three from those friendly contacts.
So not that
And
many really, but more than one,
I would say more than one. Yeah, when you can only launch a podcast once,
right?
and it's important to capitalize on that momentum. If you launch a podcast with one episode, folks listening to it, they listen to it, and if they want more, they can't satisfy that, their curiosity. So if you launch with multiple episodes, folks listen to one and they see that you have one or two more, they can listen to those and then they can get more deeply invested in your show so that when you publish the next episode, they're already a couple episodes in and you can kind of continue that momentum.
But you're saying two is sufficient if necessary.
Sure, I would say two is better than one. Three is better than two to launch for
Is there an
sure.
optimal number?
I would recommend three.
Okay.
I think three is a good number. If we're talking about, like a 30-minute conversation, give or take 15 minutes, right? Um, so, I think that would be a great, three is a great number to launch with. There was one podcast that I produced called Accounting for Innovation, and we took an interesting approach to the way that we launched that show. We recorded 5 episodes and we launched them all in the same week: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And the thought was, and we did this intentionally because we launched it that first week in May, or it might have been the second week in May. But anyways, our thought was, let's blitz the market when accountants come out of hibernation.
Mm.
And so I think that what that just goes to show is, there's no one size fits all solution to how you should launch a podcast. You can launch a podcast a number of different ways. The Amplify podcast, which is a podcast for the Association for Accounting Marketing, they launch 5 or 6 episodes in seasons every quarter,
Mm.
all at the same time, so that their listeners can go and they can binge the all those episodes.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
So again, like there's no one size fits all way. So when I say I recommend launching with three, the reason that is, again, we talked about capitalizing on that launch momentum And then from there, if you're able to establish a cadence, which is another important piece of podcasting, is having that cadence, whether it's weekly, twice monthly, or monthly,
Or
um,
seasonally, it turns out.
or seasonally, it turns out if you've got a bunch of content, yeah, establishing that cadence is important too, because your listeners then know to expect episodes and know when to expect episodes.
Got it. Okay. Now, what about sort of hardware? What do we need to record in terms of audio quality? Do we need to do video as well?
Well, before we get to the equipment, I want to touch on the guests real quick.
Okay.
So launching with your friendly contacts, and then what the next step, in my opinion, is to look at your contacts in terms of who are the up and coming thought leaders in your niche, and then reaching out to them, pointing to your existing episodes as kind of like social
Mm-hmm.
proof
Mm-hmm.
and saying, hey, I launched this podcast. Here it is. You can listen to it. Would love to have you on as a guest. And so you're reducing risk by showing them proof of concept and that you have a show. And then once they get on, their names, as they build their personal brands, the value of their episodes on your show grows as well over time. It's kind of like stocks, right?
Right.
And then the third group of guests, I would say, are these are your dream guests. These are folks that if you feel really confident, maybe there's an up and coming thought leader that you had on and you want to say, hey, I talked to this person, would love to have you on as well. They're kind of stepping stones up to those dream guests that you can have. So I just wanted to kind of close that out. And that's how I would recommend organizing your ideal guests in those three buckets.
That makes a lot of sense. And I will say that having a podcast is an amazing way to get people who would otherwise not give you 30 or 60 or however many minutes of their time. Suddenly they're like, oh, yes, I would love to come on your show and promote my book or whatever it is that they're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in every single situation, but it's a heck of a lot more compelling than, hey, I'd like to talk to you for 30 to 60 minutes for no money.
Totally. And it's funny. I think it was on the Visible Expert podcast, and I think we were only 10 episodes in, and I did a Hail Mary and I reached out to Rand Fishkin and I said, hey, do you want to come on my show? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. I was blown away. I was expecting a hard no, but then we were able to interview Rand Fishkin, and that was a kind of like he's on the Mount Rushmore of like podcast guests that I've had.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what you can do when you're willing to give someone else a platform and highlight what they're doing and help them spread the message that they want to spread.
Totally, totally. And it's
Okay.
in yeah, go
So
ahead.
I love that sort of three-step rollout approach when it comes to guests. And of course, if you're not doing guests, then I guess you don't have to worry about that part. But let's talk for a second about the actual stuff, because I think this
Yeah.
is where a lot of people get tripped up. And there's these days, if you Google things, there's like a million different articles about what you should be doing and the minimum this and required that or whatever. What's your take on what people need to actually start podcasting?
Yeah. Yeah. My take on this might be a little different.
Great.
Um, I think that the hardware is uh a what would you call it? Is a roadblock that you throw in front of yourself. If
Mm,
you know what I mean? I think we're living in a time where your cell phone has a microphone that's good enough to record a minimum viable podcast, at least a pilot episode.
hmm
Your MacBook or the laptop that you use is good enough to record a video.
hmm
Even if it's you got to get scrappy at the beginning and you just need to record something. And because the act of recording content is kind of like the biggest um you fear doing it, you don't want to do it, you drag your feet doing it, and then you go through it and you do it and you say, "Oh, that was a lot easier than I thought it was." And sure, there's, some pain that comes with listening to your own voice
Yes.
back and going through that whole, growth stage and evolution and learning to be comfortable with your voice. But that only comes with repetition and going through it and recording yourself and listening back and recording yourself and listening back. So my big thing is, the hardware is just kind of this mental block. and you use your phone, use your computer to start recording, and then it becomes real. And then from there, you can go out and do research and find the right equipment. And sure, I can make recommendations. This Shure MV7 is a great microphone. I've been podcasting for 5 years. I just got this a year ago. So if that's any indication on kind of like when to invest, that can happen gradually over time.
And I'm still on my ATR 2000.
There you go.
But I think
Yeah.
you raise a great point. Most of us have an incredible recording device in our pockets, especially in terms of video quality. I mean, it's not a red camera or something like that, but it's like more than good enough even for a video podcast. And I guess what I'm wondering is, would it be reasonable to think that a phone plus headphones or AirPods or whatever your preferred bud slash microphone might be, would that be sufficient?
Yeah, I think content quality is more important than audio quality. And we might have talked about this earlier today. But I
We
think it's
did, but in
worth
case people don't cross listen, I want to make sure they get it straight from the horse's
yeah,
mouth. Don't
exactly.
cross listen, people. But anyway,
It's a point worth highlighting because I think people come for the insights. They don't come for high quality audio, right? People come to hear to be educated, to learn something, and then to go and apply it for themselves. And if your audio sounds great, that's awesome. It's gonna come, it's gonna make for a better experience. It might give you marginal benefit, but I think the focus should be less on the quality of the audio and more so on the quality of the content.
got it. Okay. So if you had to define a minimal viable studio, it would literally be your phone or even just your computer.
I think your phone is a great way to start, and I think that's a little suboptimal.
Okay.
I think the act of starting is kind of a qualifier, and if you're able to get through that, then it makes sense to invest. It's sort of this like kind of like I grew up playing football and in basketball and sports and stuff. And I think basketball is a better example. And when people try out for the basketball team, one of the first things that the coach will do is they'll make you run suicides. And for those who don't know, suicide is, you run to the foul line and back, you run to half court and back, and then you run to the other baseline and back. And then you do it again and again and again and again. And the whole point of that drill is to weed out the people who aren't committed to playing basketball. And so I think like going through that exercise of recording on your phone, recording on your computer, going through it, listening, learning how to use some of the free tools like Audacity to edit
Mhm.
audio, going through that kind of like natural growth. On the other side of that, that's when I would recommend investing in a microphone. Is if you've gone through and you know what it's like to record audio and to produce audio, then I think it makes sense to invest in a camera and a mic.
Okay. Now I'm guessing there's people listening right now who are like, okay, great, that's fine. I'm just going to record myself so I can listen to my own voice and get over that fear, blah, 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 blah. But before I take my good friend who's agreeing to be my first guest on my podcast, I should at least get like a real basic mic.
I suppose. I mean, you can always have them back on again.
That's true. That's very true. And I think this ATR mic is actually cheaper than the first mic I bought when I recorded my first episode. But I bought two of them so that I could have one for each guest, which, as you and I were discussing
That
earlier,
was smart.
like to me, well, it was smart because I realized early on that having one mic that you share is a disaster, and probably not the right idea. But now that we're doing everything over Zoom, you only need one, and you can hopefully count on your guest having the other one. So let's say we do all this stuff. What should people be doing in terms of packaging the podcast for maximum benefit, not only for their audience, but for their own business?
I contend that a podcast is the best source of content, and here's why. Because it can be repurposed into video assets, it can be repurposed into audio assets, obviously. But then the transcript from your podcast episode can be used to create blog content, newsletter content, LinkedIn posts, Twitter posts, Facebook posts, whatever. There's a number of different ways that you can take a podcast and turn it into dozens of different content assets. And so I think that's kind of the paradigm, or that's the lens through which I think podcasters who are looking to maximize the marketing impact of their show should be looking at it. And there are tools that you can use to help streamline and automate parts of that process. Now, obviously, there is a human element of kind of reviewing and making sure in editing kind of transcripts because, not everybody talks like they write and writes like they talk,
Hmm.
right? Um, so there is an element of kind of editing and layering on that happens, but I think the extent to which you can repurpose and remix and re-promote your content, I think that's kind of the name of the game is how wide can you distribute it. But then I would take it a step further. And I would say that if you're just promoting your most recent podcast episode, then you're doing yourself a disservice because new subscribers this week, they didn't see or hear the episode from 3 months ago.
Hmm.
So it's your responsibility as a podcast marketer or a podcast host to make sure that the library of content assets that you have, maybe they're video snippets from an episode that you published 2 months ago, recirculate those, re-promote those, work those into future content calendars or social calendars. I think that's kind of the way to do it because you build a library of these content assets over time. You need to be using them.
Oh, well, this is so helpful for me because as people who are listening to this know, I promote the most recent episode. I'm super excited about it. That's all genuine. And then I think, gosh, I have dozens and dozen, 100 episodes, and I need to do a better job of sort of categorizing that and curating that and serving it up to people who, like you say, they might have just started listening today and they don't necessarily know what the backstory is. That's such a great reminder. Now, what about helping or getting more reach, more promotion via your guests? Any tips or mistakes to think about there?
If you can optimize the guest experience the best you can and make it easy for guests to share, that's kind of like the best way to do it in my mind is I'll give you an example. What I do with all my guests is on podcasting and professional services, I will create a blog post of the episode. I'll create a LinkedIn post of the episode and Twitter posts of the episode on launch day of
Hmm.
that particular episode. And then I'll send them an email with, hey, here are links to all of these different content assets. I'm going to add you to my newsletter because I'm going to be promoting your episode in the upcoming weeks. Um, and then I will even go as far as providing starter text for posts that they can copy and paste and edit to add their flair. And there's AI tools that make that easy. Like Cast Magic is great. Whisper is really good too. There's a number of different tools out there that can help you kind of streamline that process and make that experience easier for guests. Um, but then again, taking it a step further, once you've interviewed somebody and they've been on your podcast, that gives you an opportunity to tag them on social media, not just when you promote that one episode, but again later down the line. You have an opportunity to tag them again and again and again. Of course, you don't want to, blow up their notifications every day, but once every few weeks, I'm sure is good enough to keep that in the rotation. That way you maintain visibility.
Okay. And then how should we think about whether this is working? Like what kind of stats should we be looking at? Should we care about the number of downloads? Help people who might be kind of fumbling around here, asking for a
Again,
friend.
yeah, that's again, I downloads are great numbers. They give you a leading indication on the performance of your show, but that's not a business KPI. I mean, unless you have sponsors that you're beholden to, downloads are not a business performance indicator. So I would recommend looking at going back to the strategy of your business and how the podcast rolls up to that strategy. That's where the key performance indicator lies. That's how you know how to measure success. So if your podcast is designed to generate leads for services, then I would look at qualified business opportunities that have mentioned the podcast during early sales conversations Or if you have a contact form on your website and you have an open-ended text field that says, "How did you hear about us?" and they mention the podcast, that's another way that you can attribute business performance to your podcast. So that's just one example of if that's how your podcast plugs into your business, that's how you can measure success.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to make a quick aside here. If you happen to be using Mimiran, you can create a lead magnet and a lead capture form that ties into your show notes page, and then you can track all these metrics, leads, conversations, and revenue directly from your CRM.
Oh, that's amazing. Are you able to create like custom form fields?
You are.
They're very good. Though then there you go. You can have that open-ended text question in Mimiran CRM, and you like you said, you can embed that on your episode pages. You could embed it on um, you could embed it on like the show overview page too. If you want to, let's say that through your podcast you have an accompanying newsletter, right, where
Mhm.
you turn each episode into um, a newsletter edition. Then you can send that out too. So yeah, that's great.
Well, and if you're doing it from the show notes page, you're going to see like it's already going to be tracked. Like you don't even have to ask them to fill in a field. You're going to know they came from this particular place.
That's another good point. Yeah.
All right. So we're doing this. Hopefully, we're getting some business. We're getting some conversations. What else should people think about in terms of making the podcast something that is sort of like a core sustainable piece of their marketing strategy?
Yeah, you asked a question earlier that I think touches on this, and it's um, how many episodes should you have in the can, more or
Mhm.
less? And I think consistency is a big part of if you're going to launch a podcast, then you need to sustain that over, I would recommend at least 12 months before you start seeing a business impact. I mean, I launched my two podcasts in Q4 23. I started generating leads from both of those podcasts about 6 to 9 months later. And so
Okay.
I was going very aggressively with that marketing strategy. So just to give you kind of context around kind of the time frame, um, podcasts can have an impact on your network growth, and it's not just the guests that you have on. But we talked about earlier about having a co-host and how that can have an impact and how you can cross-pollinate your networks. I think that I did a little experiment this year where I did some cold outreach
Mhm.
to some LinkedIn connections, and I was able to connect with prospects who fit my ideal client profile, but they don't have a podcast. I was able to connect with them at about a 30% clip on LinkedIn.
Just by saying you have a podcast.
Well, no, just by saying, "Hey, I saw that you are in a professional services firm. You're a digital marketer, professional services firm. It's mid-sized. These other firms are launching podcasts, having success. Does that make sense for you? Would you like to connect?" More or less. And so I was able to connect with folks 30% of the time there. With Breaking Biz Dev, folks that we invited to follow the show on LinkedIn, or folks that found the show on LinkedIn. They're either second degree connections of me, so they're first degree connections of my co-host, or they're third degree connections because they're not connected with either of us. What I'll do is I'll they'll follow the show, and then 1 or 2 months later, after they've seen the content and are exposed to the material, I'll reach out to them and say, "Hey, saw that you're following Breaking Biz Dev. Hope you're enjoying the content. Care to connect?" And then that had a 50% connection rate. And then when I reach out to ideal guests, prospects who fit my ICP, they host a podcast, I'm able to connect with them at a 60% clip. So I think that just shows you how a podcast can have an impact on your network growth, which may be another leading indicator of lead generation down the line, right?
Okay. Now, I get what you're saying. This is a long-term play. This is not the thing you do if you
Yeah.
need revenue tomorrow. It is a, years plus endeavor. At the same time, are there things that we can do with our podcast assets or just the fact that we have a podcast kind of right away that might be more like I have to do some things versus waiting for people to come to me, but that provide d demonstrate the value of the podcast a lot quicker.
Yeah, I think we touched on it earlier, the extent to which you can repurpose and remix the content. So when you're first starting out, obviously, when you're first starting out, your podcast isn't going to start generating leads right away.
Right.
Um, but you can build towards that. And you can do that by repurposing your podcast into a blog post, into the newsletter, into all the different social media posts and so forth. I think that's probably the biggest thing that you can do. Another way to grow your listener base quickly or relatively quickly is to focus on podcast listeners and try to get in front of other podcast listeners. And the best way to do that is to be guests on other podcasts
Mm.
because those folks, they already have established shows, they have an audience. And if you're able to maybe captivate one or two of them every time that you're on a guest, as a guest on another podcast, they're likely to subscribe to your show.
That's great, and that actually was my next question, right? How do we try to grow our listener base? We don't necessarily need to be Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss or somebody like that with millions of people, but we wanna get reach with our audience.
Exactly, exactly. So I'm, for example, like you're going after solo consultants, and that's your target audience for your show. And so you would probably rather have 100 solo consultants listening to your podcast than 10,000 sports fans,
Right.
right? And so I think that just goes to show you that it's not the size of the audience that's listening to your show, it's the kinds of people that are listening. And if you're getting in front of the right people, depending on your strategy and depending on how you position the show, that's how you can have an impact.
When I think part of the challenge is, by definition, there are some very large podcasts that a ton of people listen to that we kind of think of when we think of podcasts, and those tend to be either parts of giant commercial enterprises or they're sponsorship led, which is not the model that us indie podcasters are going for, right? Like if you get to a Joe Rogan listenership and you can make tons of money off of sponsorships, great, but that's very unlikely to happen and it will not happen out of the gate, right? You
No.
have to have a different purpose for your podcast and a different revenue model for justifying the time and money investment in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's like different, like, there's a maturity that happens with podcasts over time. And, at the very front end, it's a very nascent thing. It's a very fragile thing that could die. I think what is the stat? It's like 80% of podcasts fail to reach 10 episodes or something like that. That's more or less. But
It's
like the
something
first
ridiculous.
Yeah, it's something ridiculous like that. And so if you can just survive long enough, um, then you have a chance at making it to like the next level and the next level and the next level.
Well, John, tell us a little bit about what you do to help people uh, make their podcasting dreams come true, as it were.
And so like I mentioned at the start of this, Ruben, I focus on professional services firms. So that's my niche. Um, I offer podcast marketing services to that niche. And I would say that I'm more than a podcast producer. Sure, I produce podcasts, but I also bring kind of strategic perspective and also a knowledge of digital marketing to the table. So podcast launch services, podcast guest matchmaking services. I do podcast marketing services. So if you have an existing show and you want to grow the visibility of that show by repurposing content, I help folks do that as well. Um, and that I also offer podcast host coaching services. So if you host a podcast and you want to be better as a host, I can help you out there. So that's an example of some of the kinds of ways that I can help.
So basically, soup to nuts, how do we turn your podcast into a business generation engine from strategy all the way down to we're going to edit your sound and hit publish?
If you're a professional services firm and you've got a podcast, I'm your guy.
All right. Now, where do people find you if they want to find out more?
You can go to redcedarmarketing.com. You can check out Podcasting and Professional Services, wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out Breaking Biz Dev, wherever you get your podcasts. Or you could say hi to me on LinkedIn. That's where I like to hang out.
Awesome. John, cheers. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Ruben. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. Drop an iTunes review or a review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you've got a friend who would benefit from this episode, let them know about it. If you've got a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode, but you just haven't talked to for a while, now's a great time to give them a call. Thanks for listening. Until next time.